My son-in-law had no idea I owned the company he worked for as CEO. He saw a quiet old man in a faded tweed jacket. One evening he invited me to a private dinner with his wealthy parents, and I accepted, wanting to see exactly how they'd treat a poor man. They slid a thick white envelope across the table and offered to buy my absence from my own daughter's life. 5 minutes later, the foundation of their entire world began to collapse. If you believe arrogance always comes with a price, hit like and tell me where you're watching from. The Chicago wind cut through my old jacket as I stood outside the city's finest steakhouse, watching valets rush past in coats worth more than a used car. I parked my pickup 3 blocks away. I could have bought the restaurant outright, but I've learned that wealth is a quiet shield, and ostentation is a target. I'm 69. My life has been built on 2 things: the logistics empire I created from nothing, and my daughter, Rachel. She married Sean 3 years ago. From the start I saw through him. The calculating eyes, the way he measured people by their watch brands. He believed I was a retired laborer surviving on a pension, and I never corrected him. I wanted Rachel loved for herself, not for the trust fund she didn't know existed. Tonight his parents, Howard and Cynthia, were in town to celebrate his promotion to CEO of Apex Innovations, and he'd invited me with all the enthusiasm of a man fulfilling an obligation. I walked into the private dining room. Howard sat in a custom charcoal suit, a gold watch gleaming like a weapon. Cynthia wore pearls and judgment in equal measure. Neither stood when I entered. Sean just gestured with his wineglass toward the farthest chair. Rachel wasn't there yet. Fixing her makeup, he said. The insults came fast. Cynthia asked how my little house was holding up in winter. Howard bragged about the Amalfi Coast, then asked what exactly I'd done for a living. I told him the truth. I'd spent decades moving freight, managing trucks. I just left out that I'd once owned 10,000 of them. He laughed, decided I was an uneducated warehouse hand, and Sean flushed with embarrassment at my mere presence. Then Howard reached into his jacket and slid a crisp white envelope across the mahogany table. $20,000, he said. A relocation fund. I was to invent some excuse, failing health, warmer weather, and vanish into a low-tier retirement facility, completely removed from Rachel's life. My poverty, my lack of polish, was dragging down Sean's rising trajectory. I looked at Sean and asked if he agreed. He looked me dead in the eye and said a man running a company like Apex couldn't have a father-in-law who looked like a janitor. Told me to take the money. He had no idea the company that gave him his precious image was built by the hands he was insulting. That the blind trust controlling Apex answered entirely to the man in the frayed tweed jacket across the table. Rachel walked in just then, smiling, asking about appetizers. I slid the envelope into my jacket. Howard and Cynthia exchanged a victorious glance. They thought I'd surrendered. I stood, placed a crumpled dollar bill on my plate to cover the tap water, kissed my daughter's forehead, and told her I had a headache. Then I walked out into the freezing night, and the second the door closed behind me, the quiet old man vanished. I called my attorney, Stephen, and told him, they took the bait. Order a full forensic audit of every account Sean had touched since his appointment. I drove to the skyscraper where Apex kept its executive floor, a building with a parking space that had been reserved under my name for 20 years. Stephen was waiting. He didn't ask about dinner, he already knew. I told him everything. 30 years ago, after my wife Clara died, I'd bought one broken-down truck at a police auction and built it into an empire, sleeping my infant daughter in the passenger seat because I couldn't afford childcare. 10 years ago, my heart couldn't take the pace anymore, so I folded my 70% ownership into an irrevocable blind trust and vanished from the public registry. The board hired Sean 2 years later, purely on the strength of a sharp resume and sharper suits. He thought he'd conquered the business world alone. He had no idea he was a hired hand inside a fortress I'd built. I ordered Stephen to lift the trust's anonymity, restore my name to the registry, and open the books. Within 48 hours, a team of forensic accountants had torn Apex's financials apart. The lead accountant, Valerie, found it. 18 months of shell companies, phantom vendors, forged approvals. Millions bled from the treasury into offshore accounts. And the money didn't stop in the Caymans. It flowed back into the country through fake consulting fees, straight into accounts controlled by Howard and Cynthia. The Amalfi vacation, the diamonds, 2 luxury cars, even an 80-foot yacht recently purchased for $4 million. All of it stolen from my company, used to fund the very people who'd told me to disappear. I wanted to burn with rage. Instead, I let it cool into something colder and far more dangerous. I didn't want a quiet arrest. I wanted them destroyed exactly as publicly as they'd tried to destroy me. I told Stephen, let Sean have his merger gala this weekend. Let them all climb as high as their arrogance would carry them. The higher the climb, the harder the fall. The next afternoon, Sean showed up at my house uninvited, dropped a stack of legal documents on my coffee table, and informed me the $20,000 had only been the opening offer. Now he wanted my signature on an NDA and a full renunciation of any claim to Rachel's life. Or he'd make sure I never saw her, or any grandchildren, again. I signed it, calmly. He had no idea he'd just handed me written proof of extortion against the majority shareholder of his own company. He left boasting about his gala, warning me security would throw me out if I dared show my face. That night, Rachel showed up at my door, soaked from the rain, sobbing. Her bank cards had been frozen, Sean's punishment for what he called financial irresponsibility. Worse, he'd demanded she sign over the modest inheritance her late mother had left her, claiming he needed it for a bridge loan on a Hamptons estate. I understood immediately. Sean was planning to drain everything, including my daughter's last safety net, before disappearing to some country without an extradition treaty, leaving her penniless and humiliated. I didn't tell her who I really was. She didn't need a corporate titan that night. She needed her father. I promised her the nightmare would be over by the end of the weekend, and I meant it. The next morning I froze Apex's entire treasury under my emergency shareholder authority, cutting Sean off from every account he didn't yet know he'd lost. I had Stephen summon the full executive board to a mandatory disclosure meeting, scheduled for Saturday night, in the middle of Sean's own gala. Then Stephen called the FBI's Financial Crimes Division and handed over the dossier. Federal agents would be stationed, unseen, throughout the hotel. 2 days before the gala, I ran into Howard and Cynthia at my local hardware store while loading bags of potting soil. They mocked me mercilessly in front of the cashier, called me a vagrant, said I belonged exactly where I was, covered in dirt, while they sailed off on their stolen yacht. I said nothing. I let them dig their own graves with their own mouths, paid for my soil, and walked out. The night before the gala, I pulled a bespoke midnight blue suit from a closet where it had waited 10 years, the suit I'd worn the day I stepped back from Apex. I pressed it by hand, thinking of Rachel asleep down the hall, of Sean's threats, of Howard's laughter in the hardware store. The mountain they stood on was a volcano, and I was holding the detonator. The ballroom the next night was a cathedral of crystal and gold, paid for entirely with stolen money. Sean held court at its center, glowing with false triumph, utterly unaware his credit had already been cut off. Howard and Cynthia paraded through the crowd dripping in jewelry, bought with my company's blood. Federal agents waited, invisible, at every exit. I walked in wearing the midnight blue suit, carrying a leather folder that held their ruin. The room went silent. Older board members recognized me instantly and turned pale. Sean's face failed to process what he was seeing. Howard and Cynthia intercepted me, hissing insults, ordering me out. Sean arrived and threatened me, reminded me I'd signed away my rights, promised to cut me off from Rachel forever, then snapped his fingers at security to have me dragged out. Before the guard could touch me, Stephen stepped out of the shadows. The security chief recognized him instantly as the sole representative of the blind trust, and backed off, bowing his head. Stephen walked to the stage, tapped the microphone, and announced an emergency shareholder disclosure meeting, declaring that the anonymous founder of Apex Innovations was in the room. Sean, still believing this was some grand blessing of his leadership, smiled and waited to be introduced. Stephen pointed straight at me. I climbed the stage. I opened the folder and put the evidence on the massive screens behind me. The shell companies, the forged invoices, the wire transfers, the yacht deed matched dollar for dollar to a phantom Apex account. I named Howard and Cynthia's stolen lifestyle in front of every person they'd ever tried to impress. The crowd recoiled from them like they were diseased. Sean scrambled onto the stage, sobbing, begging, claiming forgery, and I fired him on the spot, told him he was nothing but a thief in a borrowed suit. I raised my hand. The doors burst open, and a dozen federal agents marched in. Sean was cuffed on the stage, weeping. Howard bolted for a side exit and was tackled by waiting agents. Cynthia collapsed screaming as an agent stripped the stolen diamond necklace from her neck and dropped it into an evidence bag. All three were marched out of the hotel they'd once ruled, in handcuffs, in front of everyone who mattered to them. I found Rachel by the back doors, trembling, having watched it all. I told her everything, why I'd hidden my wealth, why I wanted her to know love without the shadow of money attached, and how deeply sorry I was for letting a predator like Sean into her life. She cried, but not from grief. For the first time in months, she cried from relief. 6 months later, Sean pled guilty to wire fraud and racketeering and got 10 years in federal prison. Howard and Cynthia lost everything the government could trace to the stolen money. The yacht, the cars, the accounts, even their standing. Their society friends vanished overnight. They ended up in a cramped, freezing apartment on the edge of the city, blaming each other for the ruin they'd built with their own hands, applying for jobs no one would give them. As for me, I never moved out of my small house. Rachel moved back in with me, and slowly, the light returned to her eyes. Apex Innovations is thriving again under honest leadership, with Stephen running daily operations while I stay in the shadows, exactly where I prefer to be. Rachel works at a community center now, discovering who she is, outside anyone else's shadow. Some mornings I still sit on my porch with a chipped mug of cheap coffee, watching the sun rise over an ordinary street, and Rachel sits beside me in comfortable silence. I never needed the mansion, the suit, or the empire to feel like a rich man. I already had everything that mattered, sitting quietly beside me. True power never has to shout, it simply waits, patient and unshakable, for the moment it's needed, and then it delivers judgment without ever raising its voice. If this story of quiet strength and justice moved you, like the video and tell me in the comments where you're watching from.